In just 2 short weeks, the country was torn apart, and we were now clinging to what remained to our lives. When the lights go out and don't come back on, you're now at the mercy of grade A predators. The disintegration of society meant people are going to die, and there isn't a whole lot we're going to be able to do about it. Without food, water, and power, urban metropolises were becoming wastelands. No matter where you evacuate to, life is uncertain, precarious, and menacing. When the asphalt jungles become uninhabitable, the refugees will have no choice but to flee to the suburban and rural areas. Mass migration is very seldom a peaceful process. Most of America only has 3 days of food stored in their house. 11 days past that 3-day expiration that most ran out. Hungry, desperate, and famished people are now some of the most dangerous and vile individuals you could encounter. If in fact the sinners of society was a real threat, who was going to stop large organized gangs from taking over? It's easy to be gripped by despair living in a dystopian existence. Those who control large amounts of food and other resources will become very powerful. Criminal cliques were already making their move to acquire assets to make them the kings of this new country. I was still shell-shocked about losing years of precious preps as Blake and I came up on the 2 Polaris sleds. The rope that he was hogtied to was still attached to the snowmobile that dragged him up and down streets, punishing his body. It was only appropriate that now we would be using that same cord to bind the slain sinner with. Blake was an avid snowmobile rider, often taking trips up to the Tug Hill area of New York on adventures with his wife and friends. He asked if I've ever drove a snow sled before. My only experience was totaling and wrecking a buddy's sled the first day he got it. A spectacular crash that resulted in me splitting my helmetless head and face open and tearing muscles in my legs as I flipped over the handlebars. I was 15 years old and had to be placed on a sled and dragged back home as I was unable to walk. I hid the injuries from my overbearing father for a full day before he found out when I skipped school the next day. "We'll try and keep it upright and operational tonight," Blake responded. "This isn't going to be a war of attrition. We're going to strike hard, be ruthless and merciless." "They drew first blood, not me," Blake said. The weather was beginning to deteriorate. The temperature was plummeting. The winds were beginning to roar to life, and the snow squalls that had been so persistent began to intensify. The scene was set. We would be riding into battle as an abominable blizzard had moved into our town. The day of reckoning was finally upon us as we started the sled simultaneously. The blustery night was dismal and bleak. The illumination of the headlights revealed just how heavy and substantial the whiteout was. Visibility was less than 10 feet. Travel was going to be treacherous and trifling. I was more concerned with Jim and Jody traversing the neglected, unplowed, and dormant roads of doomsday than I was with Blake and I. Returning to the nightmarish scene of the blazing inferno, we recovered the deceased decoy body that had already been smothered in a few inches of fluffy snowpack. Blake quickly jumped off his snowmobile and began to tie a polymer knot, arguably the strongest all-around knot around, the sinner's legs that would be towed behind my sled. Jim and Jody were anxiously awaiting direction as they were already sheltered inside the warmth of the Ford F-150 pickup truck. After performing one last weapons check and making sure our remaining comms were still functioning, we set off for our destination and date with vengeance. I took one last look back at what used to be our home before the world fell apart and knew there was no returning to normalcy. The annihilation of Armageddon was here to stay. Life had now been forever changed. I think the hardest part of existing in SHTF is taking another life. Regardless of the circumstances, it was forever a life-alternating event that carried a heavy burden on your conscience. And now, Our caravan of 4 was departing our home to do just that, execute another existence as we dragged a bullet-ridden dead body behind our procession. With one quick arm signal and a tap on the hood of the snow-covered truck, our antagonistic squad began to roll out. Blake and I rode side by side as Jimmy and Jody trailed behind, helping to brighten the threatening jet-black landscape. The eerie and ghostly silence quickly imploded with thunderous and booming explosions, as the fire we left behind had finally consumed my remaining ammunition and large quantities of propane. I glanced down at the handlebar mirror and witnessed the bright orange fireball shoot high into the ruinous apocalyptic sky. The route to Blake's residence of atrocity would take us within mere yards of the food town we had visited back on day 1. When panic-stricken shoppers hoped to gather critical supplies in hopes of repelling starvation and famine. We exited our complex for the first time since a deadly encounter and rescue mission at the senior center, just days after the solar flare devastated and ransacked our society. We headed north on Route 259 towards the center of town. Multiple vehicles were left abandoned after becoming stuck on the impenetrable snow-covered roads. Desperate and dire individuals hoping to escape unlivable conditions, only to realize their compact cars stood no chance of negotiating through close to 3 feet of snow, covering everything. Most survivors would be at the mercy of Mother Nature now, hoping and praying for warmer temperatures and a thaw so they could navigate roads to safer locations. If and when that day ever arose, their biggest threat would be heinous highwaymen and diabolical road-blocking raiders. By spring, main roads would be the most dangerous place you can be. You'll never know what monsters are hiding in the shadows ready to ambush you as you're fleeing for safer sanctuaries. It was one thing to be outside the safety of a structure in daylight during Doomsday, but to be out maneuvering during the midnight hours of madness was bone-chilling, daunting, and utterly terrifying. It was a different kind of feeling vulnerable. You were exposed to all the evils that the apocalypse produces. I was nervously awaiting some form of omen of death to visit us on our excursion as we continued down the road. Piercing through the sideways falling snow, numerous small business structures were reduced to rubbles of ashes. Every so often, you could hear the faint echo of gunshots being fired off in the distance. I seriously doubt anyone is hunting wild game in the pitch-black dark winter night sky, I thought to myself. Was it vigilante citizens protecting their resources, or predators of the collapse, preying on unsuspecting victims, I wondered. Maybe that whole SOS, sinners of society, had some truth to it. By now, there had to be large groups formed, determined on devouring and destroying whoever they came across like a biblical swarm of locusts, swallowing up resources and supplies while ruthlessly killing the males and detaining the females in imprisonment. The grocery store we visited the day after the solar flare would forever change our lives by now had to be depleted and ransacked. As we approached it, you could hear hungry vultures scavenging for scraps inside and see the illumination of flashlights as they desperately hunted for anything that was left behind. As the sound of our snow machines purred and pulsated off neighboring buildings, those few demoralized survivors ran out, shining their lights on us, hoping to flag us down. So hopeless and disheartened, they didn't even take into consideration that we could have been baleful boogeymen that exploited and swindled the weak. I glanced back at Jim and Jody behind us, winding my right arm in a circular motion to signal to keep pressing ahead. We were on a critical mission and had no time to stop and stumble upon a possible ambush. Travel was slow and daunting as we plowed through the enormous amounts of snow and the strenuous and punishing weather conditions. Visibility was abysmal at best, but it was important and critical to make mental notes of houses we passed. Were there signs of occupancy? The radiance of candlelights? The smell of smoke exiting from chimneys? or the bullseye sound of a generating, powering, life-preserving provisions that would put a giant target on your residence. I had worked almost 18 years at my current employer, visiting 5 to 6 houses per day. I'd estimate I'd probably visited over 50% of the homes in my town. I never hoped, wished, or prayed for a societal collapse, but I made sure to take notes of the addresses I visited. If Armageddon ever actually happened, I had a catalog of potential honey holes that were stocked with supplies, resources, and rations that could help us prosper and thrive. When I would arrive at a customer's house, I was collecting information, such as how many people inhabited the location, a rough estimate of their ages, and most importantly, what assets and possessions lined the walls. For example, was there a lot of food stored in the basement? How many chest freezers were on location? And if and where I witnessed the gun safe sat. How much fuel was stored in their garage? What type of vehicles they drove? Did they have dogs? And would they be a soft target? Were all questions I asked myself while repairing or installing their internet service. That same kind of reconnaissance was even more important now as our world continued to deteriorate at an alarming rate. I was a prepper and was always observant of my surroundings, whether on the clock or off the clock pre-CME. It was never my intent to pillage and plunder in a world gone mad. That's why I spent years preparing and stockpiling reserves for a worst-case scenario. But in a matter of mere minutes, I had lost almost everything I had amassed. I stored everything in one location stupidly. I ignored the idea of having vital caches hidden away in inaccessible locations for future use. Now we were going to have to forage, which was the polite way of saying looting to be able to live and survive. There was no telling how much of Blake's supplies the sinners of society had exhausted and wasted. If we weren't successful in our self-slaughter mission, it wouldn't matter anyway. We were slowly and finally approaching the road that Blake's house resided on. Once he and I turned right off of Route 259 and onto Route 33, Jim and Jody were directed to hunker down and hole up at the intersection. Keep the vehicle running and stay alert for any possible threat. Once we secured the scene and disposed of the repulsive sadist, we'd radio the two of them to proceed to the destination. As we navigated the final turn, I held up my right fist, indicating for the two of them to stop. Blake and I, along with our dead decoy that trailed behind, were maneuvering on the final half mile ourselves. We were now just minutes away, finally, from exercising the final execution and extracting revenge and vengeance on the last remaining predator. It wasn't a densely populated road. Each house sat on a few acres with a little less than a quarter of a mile separating neighbors. By now, Blake was laser-focused and hell-bent on retribution. He pointed and yelled, "There!" as his property came into view, pressing forward on the thumb throttle, increasing his speed and jetting ahead. The odor and scent of the wood-burning fireplace was the first thing I noticed on the 2-story colonial. The boisterous ringing of his generator was the first apparatus I heard as we plowed forward onto the snow-packed front yard. Around and around we went in a circular formation, revving the engines, hoping to draw out our intended target. "Stick to the plan, Blake," I said to myself. It would be easy for him to abandon it with the range of emotions he was experiencing. On our third pass, the red front door with a holiday wreath flung open, revealing the last remaining wrongdoer. In his right hand was Blake's Smith & Wesson M&P. As he charged out the door, his left hand pulled and yanked a partially clothed Jennifer behind him. A dilemma we were not prepared for. No way could we risk taking a shot and potentially striking her. "What took you two bastards so long?" he yelled out over the sound of our engines with a grimacing and disturbing look on his unshaven face. Before he could identify us and spoil our scheme, Blake stood up, launched himself off the sled, catapulting his body into the center with such force the two of them, along with Jennifer, toppled to the snow-covered ground. The two of them immediately struggled for control of the sidearm as Jennifer cried out for help. "It's me, Jennifer, your husband Blake," he announced as he continued to tussle for possession of the M&P. Before I could join the fracas, the husband and wife team began to assert their dominance and disarm the devil. Outnumbered 3-1 and overpowered, he was now at the mercy of the high school sweethearts. Blake and I pinned him down while his wife delivered devastating pistol whips to his unholy face. The bridge of his nose was busted wide open as colossal amounts of blood began drowning his face. Just as soon as she started dealing vengeance, she quickly disappeared back into the house. "Where are you going?" Blake asked as she vanished from our eyesight. The vagabond began begging for clemency as he choked on his own blood. And as fast as she departed, she swiftly reappeared, now armed with the same axe she was forced to sever her husband's fingers with. Still stained and soiled with his blood on it, she was hell-bent and committed to doing the same to the last remaining marauder. Instead of fingers, she began chopping limbs like she was splitting wood. Repeated and precise blows to the insides of both elbows. Both Blake and I were immersed in the gore and carnage of his butchered blood. The once pure and immaculate white snow was now discolored and blemished from the slaughter. His ordeal had only just began when Jennifer ordered us to strip his pants off, and in shades of Lorena Bobbitt, she began to neuter and castrate the now unconscious monster. Once satisfied and exhausted from administrating her annihilation, she collapsed into her husband's arms. The emotional embrace brought an end to her hellacious and horrific nightmare she suffered through.